Renascence. White. It was a white shape, a rectangle, emerging in front of me out of the darkness. That shape formed my very first memory. Darker rectangles revealing themselves around its edges was my second. I realized I was looking upwards at a white ceiling in a small area with dark walls. A brighter rectangle existed in the furthest wall, but I wasn't yet sure if that was a portal to the outside or some strange light. Gazing down at the more immediate distance, I saw a rounded shape beneath some gray material. The shape moved, and as it moved, somehow I felt it. The shape seemingly belonged to me. An instinctual effort raised two shapes at the side of the bulk of the main shape, and as they raised the gray material, slid downwards. The raised shapes were long and narrow, with clumps of even smaller such shapes at the end. They were soft and bent in the middle. They weren't shaded like the rest of the surroundings, they had an actual color. It was a pale color that gave the impression to me of something organic. Soon they began to feel heavy. There was gravity here. I lowered them again, which brought instant relief. And that is when I noticed the main shape of me was constantly rising and falling slightly. The movements were accompanied by a faint vibration and matched a feeling in the lower center of where I felt my conscious thoughts were focused. I was making those vibrations. Some kind of gas exchange with the environment, I assumed. A tingling restlessness in my lower being caused me to stir, and once again, two shapes on either side were made evident. These were both larger and longer than the previous pair, and they were covered in lots of tiny wires. Through force of will, I was, eventually, able to move them around. Trying to lift them caused a pressure in my midsection and a strained feeling that ran up my center. I struggled and managed to form the shapes into a kind of double-topped hill under the material that still covered most of me. I pulled the smaller, narrow shapes that were closer to me up, and the clumps at the ends made a kind of opening and closing motion as I attempted to use them to remove the cover entirely. I only managed to half complete the task. Comprehending these shapes to be my limbs had been the first step. Mastering their movements would be the next. A combination of moving all four of my limbs eventually allowed me to discard the material cover completely from my body. It fell off to one side and was hanging down from the soft object I was prostrate upon. As I moved around, it creaked a little as if metal was embedded in it. Looking down upon myself, I could see more of the pale pink of my form, but also two distinct darker peaks covered in small black wires. Very fine and thin wires that seemed to react to my limb clumps when placed on them. Like tiny electrical signals, not unpleasant. They also surrounded a shallow hole further down my trunk. Even further down, I saw more material, similar to that of the cover, but black and wrapped fully around my midsection. Both of the larger pair of limbs protruded from the black wrapping as if it had holes specifically made for each of them. I was noticing other things too. More electrical signals, but triggered by vibrations. I later understood them to be sounds. They formed a weirdly stereoscopic effect within my consciousness. Most movements were accompanied by these sounds. The movements of my body and limbs created subtle versions. But at one point, a storm arose inside me, and released in bliss with a sound so loud and violent, I feared for my life. A rush of the vibrations from the part of my body that constantly rose and fell returned, once the feeling had faded. I wondered if I had lost time to that strange explosion. Such was its effect upon me. Tiny particulates hung in the air and left my upper parts feeling damp. Stirring from one side to the other, and with a more adept use of my limbs, I managed to haul my body into a more upright position. I could feel the back of me against soft mounds. I pushed my limb clumps up against my consciousness and was able to make out solid shapes there. I had a head. This part of me was fascinating. The lowest part moved up and down and had a wet limb of its own that moved and pressed into both hard ridges and other soft parts. Further up there was a protrusion which I identified as the source of vibrations that matched my rising and falling upper trunk. Even further up were two sunken spherical objects which I realized were the source of all the images feeding into my conscious mind. I had a face. At either side of my head were shell-like objects, and atop all of that were many more of the wires. They were much longer and thinner than the ones on my trunk, though. I felt the contraction in my lower region again, and it felt much more urgent. My limb clumps felt some squishy shapes concealed within the black wrap. They seemed to have some connection to the contractions, but I could not yet discern why. I was determined to get myself off the large object that creaked in order to explore my surroundings further. Two new clumps revealed themselves to me as I attempted to maneuver myself around. They were each on the end of the large pair of limbs, and they were similar to the other clumps, except elongated, and the grabby parts were incredibly short and limited. Strangely amusing, I thought. With several more pushes and rolls, I managed to swing my entire body around and had the lower limbs dangling free from the creaking object I was still on, while I stabilized the rest of me upright, using my upper limbs as braces. I took pause and allowed several more gas exchanges to occur before continuing my efforts. I had noticed that while I was struggling, I would seemingly hold in the gas. If I didn't let it out to continue the exchange, then my consciousness began to fracture a little. It felt good to not pause the gas exchange for too long. I continued my motions by pushing with my upper limbs, and my body reached far enough that my lower limb clumps eventually touched what was beneath. It felt hard, and I recognized another new sensation. I could tell that it was low on the temperature scale. With both lower limbs anchored below, I managed to rock and shuffle the rest of me until I was at the very edge of the object. After waiting to take in many more gas exchanges, I gave a final huge push with both upper limbs and willed my consciousness forward. Suddenly, I was viewing everything from much higher up. I could see many more hard and soft objects of all kinds. To one side of me, I could see a huge rectangular object rotated inwards, revealing a massive hole of similar shape. I wanted to go to the hole, but I was unstable. I was swaying around as my lower limbs instinctively attempted to compensate. My whole body was moving back and forth, too. It didn't feel good, and as my weight shifted back, I flung my upper limbs forward in the hopes my clumps could catch hold of the large rectangle next to the hole. I missed. The crash to the ground was both sudden and lengthy. Terrible electrical signals ran up from my limbs, and the sounds were alarming as they made contact. I think I hit my head on the rectangle, too. A spurt of wet erupted from my head. It was a beautiful, deep color, but was also accompanied with the most severe of the electrical signals. My consciousness swam around, and a low, groaning sound came out of my face. I lay there on my front for quite a while. The negative electrical signals mostly died down, but there was a large pool of liquid that had emerged from around the black wrap. It smelled undesirable, and the area lower down felt weirdly cool and uncomfortable. The contractions had stopped, though, and there was an absence of tension, a feeling of relief. With renewed effort, I used my limbs and my improving sense of balance to get myself upright again. This time, I used every available object my upper limbs could reach to guide myself to the rectangular hole. I was careful to plant my lower limbs and rebalance before taking the next step forward. Slow and steady. I incidentally brushed my right upper limb against my face at one point, and it returned into view smeared with that alluring deep color from when I fell. I could smell it too. It had a distinct metallic resonance. I didn't know why it appealed to me so much, but it did. Finally, standing in the middle of the rectangular hole, propped up on either side by my upper limbs, I leaned forward into the darkness and turned my head from side to side. There was only more darkness to the left of me, but to the right was a brighter area, with a whole new complement of novel objects to take in. I pushed myself out of the hole and stumbled toward the right. My body slammed from wall to wall as my upper limbs grasped as best they could. Managing to make sequential stepping motions, my progress gradually improved, and soon I was standing in the well-lit room, my optical receptors darting around as I tried to understand my new surroundings. Turning my head created a new effort to stay balanced, anchored as I was, with my left upper limb to a wall. One of the objects in the corner of the room was a box with moving images on it. It gave off sound. On the other side of the room were large, soft-shaped things that reminded me of the object I awoke upon. In the center was a flat rectangle of hard matter that, incredibly, could be seen through. Several smaller objects sat on top of it, including one that seemed very familiar to me. As I scanned the room to my left, a large rectangular piece of the wall rotated inwards, and a new object emerged from the hole that appeared. This new object was a spectacle of symmetry and moved towards me with urgency. Its outer parts resembled my own. They had the same organic color, and its head had the lower hole, mid-protrusion, and two ovals that swiveled around quickly. The top and sides of the head were covered in very long, pale versions of the wires. As it got closer, it made loud, wet, and gaseous noises. The sounds it made were chaotic, and I couldn't make any sense of them. Its upper limbs latched onto my own, and they shook me vigorously. The chaos of sounds it was making collapsed into a singular sound, which it repeated over and over again.
Sam! Sam! Sam!
"Sam, over here," his wife called to him. It was 6 a.m. in the morning, and although a faint dawn light covered the forest, it was still fairly dark. He was standing on the forest path that they used for their morning jogs together. His wife had run off into the trees abruptly after the whole sky lit up, and they had seen a streak of white fire come down close to them. The noise it made had startled him, but she seemed more excited than anything. "Katie, where are you?" he called out, scanning the trees. "Just follow the sound of my voice. Hurry, you've got to see this." He stumbled forward in the direction that was his best estimation of where his wife's voice was coming from. He tripped on a tree root and almost snagged his jacket on a low-hanging branch, but within 100 yards or so he found her. "Look," she said, pointing at a hole in the forest floor. "I can feel heat coming off it." Sam put his hand on her shoulder as he approached her, partly for balance, but also for reassurance. He peered down into the huge hole below them. There were red, burning embers at the edges and wisps of smoke. Katie was using the flashlight on her phone to illuminate the area, but it wasn't until she moved the light into the center that they could see the small, oblong shape resting there. He wondered if it was the remains of the meteor, although its shape seemed strangely artificial. "That streak we saw coming down into the forest. The meteor must have landed here and made that crater," he told her. "Is that thing in the middle the meteorite then?" Katie asked. "What's left of it, I guess." "But it looks like a box. Such a strange color, too." Katie took a small step and was about to walk into the crater until Sam pulled her back. "Wait," he said. "It could be dangerous." "Should we call someone?" she asked. "It might be worth money." "Who would we call? I don't think we've got phone service out here anyway." Sam started taking his jacket off and moved slowly towards the box. "What are you doing?" asked Katie. He was holding his jacket with both hands in front of him as if carrying a fishing net. "I'm going to take it back into town with us. It might be valuable." "Don't burn yourself on it." "No, it's cold. I don't feel any heat coming off it at all." Sam had grasped the artifact and was bundling it up in his jacket. "Let's go," he said. Their car ride home was uneventful. Sam had placed the object, still wrapped up, into the trunk as a precaution, just in case it was giving off radiation or any strange gases. Katie kept talking excitedly about their discovery. They would probably get their photo in the local paper, she told him. It could have scientific importance, and they may even make a little money from it. Sam didn't think so, but he was definitely interested in examining the object once they got it home. He didn't disagree with her, though. This was the happiest he'd seen her since she lost the baby. The main reason he insisted on their early morning runs was because he knew that regular exercise helps to reduce depression. It helped to get her out of the house as well. The dawn had given way to daylight by the time Sam was parking the car outside their small cottage on the edge of town. He carefully carried his jacket into the living room and tipped the artifact from it onto the glass surface of their coffee table. Its strange color seemed bolder now, and it emitted a resonant hum. Katie was still outside of the house, talking to her mother on her mobile. The reception was better outside. She was sharing the news about their exciting discovery. Sam didn't care about talking to anyone about the artifact. Now that he was alone with it, he just wanted to understand what it was. It pulsed and shimmered. He couldn't resist putting his hands on it, and when he did, he realized it wasn't cold anymore. Heat ran from its surface up through his fingers, and the humming it made became more intense. The feelings it stirred in him were previously unfathomable. He fantasized about a strange, amorphous creature kissing him and probing his body with its tentacle protrusions. There was an egg being pushed into his throat. Lights danced through his head, and an unfamiliar song filled his ears. His body twitched and his arms and legs filled with intense emotions. At first it felt ecstatic, but soon it felt painful. The lights became dimmer and the song became the sound of screaming. His body was on fire. He was exhausted. The world was agony. He banged into the walls along the passageway that led to their bedroom. Sam made it through the doorway, barely conscious of what was happening. He was so hot he stripped off his clothes and crashed onto the bed. His mind was shrinking. He clutched at the parts of him he loved the most. Walking to his mother as she smiled at him. A trip to the seaside, watching boats and eating ice cream. His high school crush, the smell of her perfume. His first car, a blue Ford Mustang, his father was so proud. His friends celebrating in caps and gowns. Meeting Katie for the first time. His first promotion at work. Katie telling him she was pregnant. The taste of chocolate, of coffee, of salt, and then colors. Yellow, red, then green. Blackness. Coldness. He pulled the bed cover over him in a pitiful attempt to conserve the very last of his energy. He was so tired. Soon even the feeling of emptiness was gone too. Drifting. Fading. He had become nothing.